Brooklyn, Iowa. Summer of 2018. A home security camera mounted on a residential property records an ordinary Tuesday evening. The street is quiet, the light is long, nothing is wrong. A young woman runs through the frame. She moves at a runner's pace, steady, deliberate, the kind of rhythm that comes from habit. She passes through and she's gone. Then a black Chevrolet Malibu appears. It moves slowly. Then it appears again. Same car, same slow pace. And then again. Nobody watching that footage in real time flagged it as significant. It was just a street, just a car, just a summer evening in a small Iowa town where nothing much happened. But weeks later, after a family stopped sleeping, after search teams covered hundreds of miles of farmland, after federal investigators joined a case that had no crime scene and no suspect, investigators pulled that footage again, and the car that had circled a young woman's running route became the thread that unraveled everything. That runner was Mollie Tibbetts. The camera did not record what happened to her. It didn't capture a confrontation, a struggle, or a confession. It captured only a pattern. A car that had no reason to keep returning anyway. What investigators didn't know was that this footage would become the only thing standing between a family's hope and a case going cold. On the morning of the 19th of July 2018, Mollie Tibbetts did not show up for work. That fact alone, an absence, a missing morning, is where the official record of this case begins. Mollie was 20 years old. She was home in Brooklyn for the summer after finishing her first year at the University of Iowa, where she was studying psychology. She had a job at a local children's day camp. She had a boyfriend, Dalton Jack, who was out of town for work. She had plans to return to Iowa City in the fall for her sophomore year. She was not the kind of person who disappeared without a word. When she missed her shift, the people expecting her tried to reach her. She didn't respond. Her family couldn't find her. Her boyfriend couldn't reach her.
She might have a Fitbit on, and she might have her cell phone, but obviously we've tried just calling her, but it's either off or dead. So it goes straight to voicemail.
The worry that had been quiet and private became something that required a phone call to law enforcement.
We are pleading with you to please release her.
You know, if they're listening, then I would just like them to know that, imagine this was you. Just do the right thing and, let her go.
A missing person report was filed. Mollie's mother, Laura Calderwood, and her father, Rob Tibbetts, now had to answer investigators' first question. When had anyone last seen her? The answer pointed back 24 hours to the previous evening, July 18th, to a run. She had gone out for an evening jog through Brooklyn, as she had done many times before. The town was familiar territory. The route was familiar territory. Running was not something Mollie did recklessly. It was part of who she was. She had run cross-country in high school. She knew these streets. She went out. She did not come back. And now, a day later, with no trace of her and no explanation, investigators had to start from the last known moment, the run. Everything that followed would depend on what had happened in the hours between when she left and when the morning came without her. The 18th of July, 2018. Early evening. Mollie laces up and heads out for a run through Brooklyn. A witness places her on the east side of town at approximately 7:45 p.m. She is moving. She is alive. Nothing visible is wrong. Her phone moves with her. That detail matters more than it sounds. In a case with no witnesses to what happened next, the phone becomes the closest thing investigators have to a timeline. And at 7:45, the phone confirms what the witness confirms. Mollie is running, eastbound, through familiar streets. Then the data changes. At some point after that sighting, Mollie's phone begins moving south, not at a running pace. At roughly 60 miles per hour, the phone leaves Brooklyn heading south, and its last recorded ping places it near Guernsey, a small community several miles outside of town. That shift from running speed to vehicle speed is not an explanation. It doesn't identify anyone. It doesn't show a vehicle or a driver or a confrontation, but it draws a line. Before that shift, Mollie running in Brooklyn. After that shift, Mollie's phone moving in someone else's vehicle. Investigators now understood that the evening had not simply ended. It had been interrupted. Something had changed the direction of that phone, and by extension, the direction of Mollie's life. The last confirmed location was south of town. South, through fields and rural roads, into countryside that could conceal almost anything. The missing person investigation that launched after Mollie's disappearance became one of the most intensive searches in Iowa's recent history. It had to be. Brooklyn sits in Poweshiek County, a landscape of corn, soybeans, gravel roads, and open farmland that stretches for miles in every direction. If someone wanted to hide a person or a trail, the geography made it easy. The search teams had too much land and too little to anchor them. Local law enforcement moved first. Then, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation arrived. The FBI joined. Homeland Security personnel became involved. Community volunteers turned out by the hundreds, neighbors, students, strangers who had seen Mollie's face on news broadcasts and driven to Brooklyn to help. Tips flooded in, thousands of them. Investigators reviewed phone records, Fitbit data, Mollie's social media, her known contacts, and her regular routines. They interviewed people who had seen her, people who knew her, people who had been in the area that evening. They searched fields on foot. They deployed resources across multiple counties. Nothing produced Mollie. Nothing produced a suspect. The frustration of those weeks is difficult to overstate. A young woman had vanished from a small town in broad daylight or close enough to it. And with all of the resources that had converged on Brooklyn, the case remained open. No crime scene. No confirmed abduction site. No body. Only the phone data pointing south and a town that refused to stop looking. Somewhere in the evidence that had already been collected, the answer existed. Investigators just hadn't found it yet. It came from a home security camera on the east side of Brooklyn. The footage belonged to a local resident named Logan Collins. Investigators reviewed it as part of the broader sweep of surveillance data collected during the search: doorbell cameras, business cameras, residential security systems, anything that might have captured movement on the evening of July 18th. What they found in Collins's footage changed the shape of the investigation. The footage showed a runner consistent with Mollie's build and movement, passing through the frame. And then, it showed a black Chevrolet Malibu. The car moved through the area. Then it came back. Then it came back again. Over roughly 20 minutes, the vehicle circled the same area approximately 6 times. Chrome handles. Chrome mirrors. A detail specific enough to be useful. A person passing once could be dismissed. A car that returns 6 times tracing the same route, in the same window of time that a young woman disappeared, is a different kind of evidence entirely. Investigators were not looking at an accident or a coincidence. They were looking at deliberate, repeated behavior. The case had no name yet. It had no suspect. But it finally had something that could be searched. A vehicle. A specific make. A specific model. Specific chrome details, and a pattern of movement that lined up precisely with where Mollie had been running. The investigation was no longer searching for anyone who might have crossed Mollie's path. It was searching for one car. Law enforcement circulated what they knew about the vehicle. A black Chevrolet Malibu with chrome handles and mirrors. Deputy Steve Kivy was the one who found it. He spotted a Malibu that matched the description, same color, same details, and followed it. When he stopped the vehicle, the driver was identified as Christian Bahena Rivera. Rivera was not a name investigators had encountered during the search. He hadn't been flagged by tips. He wasn't connected to Mollie through any known relationship. He was a dairy farm worker who lived and worked in the area near Brooklyn, employed at a farm that operated on the same kinds of rural roads that surrounded the town. He was identified through his car. Nothing else. Investigators now had a face behind the vehicle that had circled Mollie's running route 6 times. They had a person who could either explain the footage or couldn't. The next step was a conversation. Rivera agreed to speak with investigators. He agreed to searches of his vehicles. He walked into the process voluntarily. What he said next, and what he said after that, and what he said after that, would become the most contested portion of the entire case. Investigators made contact with Rivera at the dairy farm where he worked. He signed consent forms authorizing searches of his Chevrolet Malibu and another vehicle. Then he agreed to go to the Poweshiek County Sheriff's Office to answer questions. Officer Pamela Romero conducted much of the interview in Spanish, Rivera's primary language. The session was recorded. Rivera's first answer was simple. He didn't know Mollie Tibbetts, hadn't seen her, had nothing to offer. That held for a short time. Then it changed. He acknowledged seeing a woman running. Then he acknowledged seeing her more than once. Then, according to prosecutors, he admitted that he had found her attractive, that he had noticed her on the route, and continued watching her. His account kept moving. According to the prosecution's evidence, Rivera described getting out of the car and approaching Mollie. He said she threatened to call the police. He described becoming angry, and then he said he blacked out. What followed the blackout in his account was something he claimed not to fully remember. He said he came back to awareness with Mollie's body in a cornfield. He said he used her own earbuds to drag her further into the field and covered her with corn stalks. He said he drove away. The defense would later challenge nearly every element of this account. They would argue the interview was conducted under conditions exhaustion, language barriers, immigration pressure, extended questioning that made the statements unreliable. They would raise questions about whether Miranda rights had been properly administered. The Iowa Court of Appeals would later review these suppression issues. But in the room that day, what investigators heard was a version that began with denial and ended with directions. And Rivera said he could show them where she was. It was the 21st of August, 2018. 34 days had passed since Mollie went out for her run. 34 days of searching farmland, reviewing data, following tips, and finding nothing. Rivera led investigators to a field. They followed him into the rural countryside south of Brooklyn, through the same landscape that had swallowed every search effort for over a month, and he brought them to a cornfield. Rows deep. No obvious marker. No reason anyone passing would stop there. But Mollie was there. Her remains were found on August 21st. DNA testing confirmed the identification. The medical examiner examined her and ruled the cause of death a homicide, multiple sharp force injuries. She had been in that field since July 18th. The entire search, the volunteers, the federal resources, the thousands of tips had never reached this place. It took Rivera knowing exactly where to go. That knowledge was not something an innocent driver could explain. Rivera was formally charged with first-degree murder on the 22nd of August 2018. The missing person investigation, which had begun with a broken routine and a quiet alarm on a summer morning, was now a murder case. The cornfields that had been obstacles for the searchers had held the answer the entire time. The search was over. Everything that followed would happen in a courtroom. After Mollie was found, investigators turned back to the evidence they had been building since Rivera was first identified. The Chevrolet Malibu was processed thoroughly. Early in the investigation, a hair recovered from the trunk had been considered as potential evidence. Later testing showed it was not Mollie's. That lead closed. But the trunk held something else. Blood. Blood was recovered from the trunk of Rivera's Malibu and submitted for DNA analysis. The results were definitive. The blood matched Mollie Tibbetts. A criminal case rarely turns on one piece of evidence alone. Prosecutors build in layers, each piece reinforcing the others, each point of correspondence narrowing the range of alternative explanations. The case against Rivera was constructed from several distinct chains of proof. The surveillance footage placed his car at the scene of Mollie's run, circling repeatedly. The phone and Fitbit data showed Mollie's movement shifting from running pace to vehicle speed, placing the moment of abduction in the same window as the Malibu's presence on the footage. Rivera's own statements put him in direct contact with Mollie. His knowledge of the body's location, specific, accurate, unprompted, connected him to the field without anyone having told him where to look, and the DNA in the trunk tied Mollie physically to his vehicle. None of those pieces alone was the case. Together, they built a structure that prosecutors believed a jury could follow from the east side of Brooklyn to a cornfield south of Guernsey to a conviction. The defense would try to find the gaps. Rivera's trial did not happen quickly. Pre-trial litigation, suppression hearings, and procedural delays pushed the case into 2021. The venue was changed to Scott County, Iowa, to ensure an impartial jury. Prosecutors Scott Brown and Bart Claver presented the state's case. Defense attorneys Chad Freeze and Jennifer Freeze represented Rivera. The prosecution's theory was direct. Rivera had seen Mollie running. He had followed her in the Malibu. He had circled her route. He had approached her. She had threatened to call the police. He had killed her, placed her body in his trunk, and hidden her in the cornfield where investigators would later find her guided there by Rivera himself. Every piece of the prosecution's evidence was designed to connect those events. The footage showing the car, the digital data showing the abduction timeline, the DNA showing Mollie had been in the trunk, the body location showing Rivera knew precisely where she was. The defense built a different case. They argued investigators had moved too quickly toward Rivera and had not fully explored other possibilities. They challenged the reliability of his statements, pointing to the conditions of the interview, the length, the language barrier, Rivera's immigration status, and questions about whether his rights had been properly honored. They contended the investigation had been shaped by pressure rather than precision. And then Rivera took the stand. He told the jury a story that contradicted his earlier statements entirely. He said 2 masked men had approached him while he was driving. He said they threatened his girlfriend and his child. He said they forced him to drive to where Mollie was running, and that he killed her. He said they placed Mollie's body in his trunk while threatening him, and forced him to help dispose of her remains before letting him go. The courtroom went quiet for that testimony. It was a version of events that had never appeared in any prior statement, that no other witness supported, and that the prosecution argued was constructed specifically to introduce doubt after all other avenues had failed. The jury deliberated. They had to weigh a complete evidence chain, surveillance, digital data, DNA, body location, changing statements against a single, late-emerging alternative theory offered only from the witness stand. The case was in their hands. On the 28th of May, 2021, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. For Mollie's family, for the community that had searched for her, for the investigators who had spent 3 years building toward this moment, the verdict was the legal answer the case had required. But it was not the end. Before Rivera could be formally sentenced, the defense raised a new argument. They brought forward claims involving a man named Gavin Jones, who allegedly had confessed to knowing something about Mollie's killing and to having helped frame Rivera. If true, the defense argued, that information warranted a new trial. Prosecutors challenged the claims directly. They argued the alleged confession was inconsistent, unreliable, and lacked the credibility required to reopen the case. Judge Joel Yates reviewed the motion carefully and denied it. The standard for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence is specific. The evidence must be credible. It must have been unavailable at the time of the original trial, and it must be of a kind that would probably have changed the verdict. The court found that Rivera had not met that bar. On the 30th of August 2021, Rivera appeared for sentencing. Iowa does not have the death penalty. For a first-degree murder conviction, the mandatory sentence is life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Yates imposed that sentence. Rivera was remanded to custody. His attorneys began preparing the next stage. The conviction had survived its first serious challenge. But Rivera's legal team was not finished. Rivera appealed his conviction to the Iowa Court of Appeals. The appeal raised several arguments: that his statements to investigators had been improperly admitted, that the trial court had erred in its suppression rulings, and that the denial of the new trial motion had been an abuse of discretion. On the 11th of October 2023, the Iowa Court of Appeals issued its ruling. The conviction was affirmed. The court found that the district court had properly handled the suppression issues surrounding Rivera's statements and had not abused its discretion in denying the new trial motion. Every argument the defense raised on appeal was reviewed. None succeeded. Rivera remains incarcerated at the Anamosa State Penitentiary, serving life without parole for the first-degree murder of Mollie Tibbetts. The legal record of this case is closed. But there is something the legal record cannot fully contain. Mollie Tibbetts became a national story within days of her disappearance. Her case was absorbed into political debate, speculation, theory, and argument, most of it having nothing to do with who she was or how she had lived. Her family pushed back, publicly and consistently. They asked that she not be reduced to a symbol, a political argument, or a cautionary narrative. They asked that people remember the actual person, not the case name, not the verdict, not the evidence exhibits. Before any of this happened, Mollie Cecilia Tibbetts was a 20-year-old woman from a small Iowa town who went to college and came home for the summer to work with children. She had run cross-country in high school. She had sung in choir and performed in school plays. She was known as someone who sought out younger students who seemed left out and made them feel included. She was studying psychology because she was interested in how people work, how they struggle, and how they heal. She went out for a run on a summer evening. The camera found the car. The evidence found the killer. The court upheld the sentence. But none of that is the full measure of what was lost. Because before Mollie Tibbetts became a case, she was a daughter, a student, a runner, and a young woman with a future still unfolding. That is what was taken on the 18th of July, 2018. That is what the record will never be able to restore. If this case stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories on this channel that deserve the same attention. We'll be back with the next one.